The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 46. I had not been in Tahiti long before I met Captain Nichols. He came in one morning when I was having breakfast on the terrace of the hotel, and introduced himself. He had heard that I was interested in Charles Strickland, and announced that he was come to have a talk about him. They're as fond of gossip in Tahiti as in an English village, and one or two inquiries I had made for pictures by Strickland had been quickly spread. I asked the stranger if he had breakfasted.
"Yes, I have my coffee early," he answered, "but I don't mind having a drop of whisky."
I called the Chinese boy.
You don't think it's too early?"
said the captain. "You and your liver must decide that between you," I replied.
"I'm practically a teetotaler,"
he said, as he poured himself out a good half tumbler of Canadian Club. When he smiled he showed broken and discoloured teeth. He was a very lean man, of no more than average height, with grey hair cut short and a stubbly grey moustache. He had not shaved for a couple of days. His face was deeply lined, burned brown by long exposure to the sun, and he had a pair of small blue eyes which were astonishingly shifty. They moved quickly, following my smallest gesture, and they gave him the look of a very thorough rogue. But at the moment he was all heartiness and good fellowship. He was dressed in a bedraggled suit of khaki, and his hands would have been all the better for a wash.
"I knew Strickland well,"
he said, as he leant back in his chair and lit the cigar I had offered him.
"It was through me he came out to the islands."
"Where did you meet him?" I asked.
"In Marseilles."
"What were you doing there?" He gave me an ingratiating smile.
"Well, I guess I was on the beach."
My friend's appearance suggested that he was now in the same predicament, and I prepared myself to cultivate an agreeable acquaintance. The society of beachcombers always replays the small pains you need be at to enjoy it. They are easy of approach and affable in conversation. They seldom put on airs, and the offer of a drink is a sure way to their hearts. You need no laborious steps to enter upon familiarity with them, and you can earn not only their confidence but their gratitude by turning an attentive ear to their discourse. They look upon conversation as the great pleasure of life, thereby proving the excellence of their civilization, and for the most part they are entertaining talkers. The extent of their experience is pleasantly balanced by the fertility of their imagination. It cannot be said that they are without guile, but they have a tolerant respect for law, when the law is supported by strength. It is hazardous to play poker with them, but their ingenuity adds a peculiar excitement to the best game in the world. I came to know Captain Nichols very well before I left Tahiti, and I am the richer for his acquaintance. I do not consider that the cigars and whisky he consumed at my expense (he always refused cocktails, since he was practically a teetotaler), and the few dollars, borrowed with the civil air of conferring a favour upon me, that passed from my pocket to his, were in any way equivalent to the entertainment he afforded me. I remained his debtor. I should be sorry if my conscience, insisting on a rigid attention to the matter in hand, forced me to dismiss him in a couple of lines. I do not know why Captain Nichols first left England. It was a matter upon which he was reticent, and with persons of his kind a direct question is never very discreet. He hinted at undeserved misfortune, and there is no doubt that he looked upon himself as the victim of injustice. My fancy played with the various forms of fraud and violence, and I agreed with him sympathetically when he remarked that the authorities in the old country were "so damned technical." But it was nice to see that any unpleasantness he had endured in his native land had not impaired his ardent patriotism. He frequently declared that England was the finest country in the world, sir, and he felt a lively superiority over Americans, Colonials, Dagos, Dutchmen, and Kanakas. But I do not think he was a happy man. He suffered from dyspepsia, and he might often be seen sucking a tablet of pepsin. In the morning his appetite was poor, but this affliction alone would hardly have impaired his spirits. he had a greater cause of discontent with life than this. 8 years before, he had rashly married a wife. There are men whom a merciful Providence has undoubtedly ordained to a single life, but who, from wilfulness, or through circumstances they could not cope with, have flown in the face of its decrees. There is no object more deserving of pity than the married bachelor. Of such was Captain Nichols. I met his wife. She was a woman of 28, I should think, though of a type whose age is always doubtful, for she cannot have looked different when she was 20, and at 40 would look no older. She gave me an impression of extraordinary tightness. Her plain face, with its narrow lips, was tight. Her skin was stretched tightly over her bones. Her smile was tight. Her hair was tight. Her clothes were tight. And the white drill she wore had all the effect of black bombazine. I could not imagine why Captain Nichols had married her, and, having married her, why he had not deserted her. Perhaps he had, often, and his melancholy arose from the fact that he could never succeed. However far he went, and in howsoever secret a place he hid himself, I felt sure that Mrs. Nichols, inexorable as fate and remorseless as conscience, would presently rejoin him. He could as little escape her as the cause can escape effect. The rogue, like the artist and perhaps the gentleman, belongs to no class. He is not embarrassed by the sans gêne of the hobo, nor put out of countenance by the etiquette of the prince. But Mrs. Nichols belonged to the well-defined class, of late become vocal, which is known as the lower middle. Her father, in fact, was a policeman. I am certain that he was an efficient one. I do not know what her hold was on the captain, but I do not think it was love. I never heard her speak, but it may be that in private she had a copious conversation. At any rate, Captain Nichols was frightened to death of her. Sometimes, sitting with me on the terrace of the hotel, he would become conscious that she was walking in the road outside. She did not call him. She gave no sign that she was aware of his existence. She merely walked up and down composedly. Then a strange uneasiness would seize the captain. He would look at his watch and sigh. "Well, I must be off," he said. Neither wit nor whisky could detain him then. Yet he was a man who had faced undaunted hurricane and typhoon, and would not have hesitated to fight a dozen unarmed niggers with nothing but a revolver to help him. Sometimes Mrs. Nichols would send her daughter, a pale-faced, sullen child of 7, to the hotel. "Mother wants you," she said in a whining tone. "Very well, my dear," said Captain Nichols. He rose to his feet at once, and accompanied his daughter along the road. I suppose it was a very pretty example of the triumph of spirit over matter, and so my digression has at least the advantage of a moral. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47. I have tried to put some connection into the various things Captain Nichols told me about Strickland, and I here set them down in the best order I can. They made one another's acquaintance during the latter part of the winter following my last meeting with Strickland in Paris. How he had passed the intervening months I do not know, but life must have been very hard, for Captain Nichols saw him first in the Asile de Nuit. There was a strike at Marseilles at the time, and Strickland, having come to the end of his resources, had apparently found it impossible to earn the small sum he needed to keep body and soul together. The Asile de Nuit is a large stone building where pauper and vagabond may get a bed for a week, providing their papers are in order and they can persuade the friars in charge that they are working men. Captain Nichols noticed Strickland for his size and his singular appearance among the crowd that waited for the doors to open. They waited listlessly, some walking to and fro, some leaning against the wall, and others seated on the curb with their feet in the gutter. And when they filed into the office, he heard the monk who read his papers address him in English. But he did not have a chance to speak to him, since, as he entered the common room, a monk came in with a huge Bible in his arms, mounted a pulpit which was at the end of the room, and began the service which the wretched outcasts had to endure as the price of their lodging. He and Strickland were assigned to different rooms, and when, thrown out of bed at 5 in the morning by a stalwart monk, he had made his bed and washed his face, Strickland had already disappeared. Captain Nichols wandered about the streets for an hour of bitter cold, and then made his way to the Place Victor Gelu, where the sailor men are wont to congregate. Dozing against the pedestal of a statue, he saw Strickland again. He gave him a kick to awaken him. "Come and have breakfast, mate," he said. "Go to hell," answered Strickland. I recognised my friend's limited vocabulary, and I prepared to regard Captain Nichols as a trustworthy witness. "Busted?" asked the captain. "Blast you!" answered Strickland. "Come along with me. I'll get you some breakfast." After a moment's hesitation, Strickland scrambled to his feet, and together they went to the boucher de pain, where the hungry are given a wedge of bread, which they must eat there and then, for it is forbidden to take it away, and then to the cuillere de soupe, where, for a week, at 11 and 4, you may get a bowl of thin salt soup. The two buildings are placed far apart, so that only the starving should be tempted to make use of them. So they had breakfast, and so began the queer companionship of Charles Strickland and Captain Nichols. They must have spent something like 4 months at Marseilles in one another's society. Their career was devoid of adventure, if by adventure you mean unexpected or thrilling incident, for their days were occupied in the pursuit of enough money to get a night's lodging and such food as would stay the pangs of hunger. But I wish I could give here the pictures, coloured and racy, which Captain Nichols's vivid narrative offered to the imagination. His account of their discoveries in the low life of a seaport town would have made a charming book, and in the various characters that came their way the student might easily have found matter for a very complete dictionary of rogues. But I must content myself with a few paragraphs. I received the impression of a life intense and brutal, savage, multicoloured, and vivacious. It made the Marseilles that I knew, gesticulating and sunny, with its comfortable hotels and its restaurants crowded with the well-to-do, tame and commonplace. I envied men who had seen with their own eyes the sights that Captain Nichols described. When the doors of the Asile de Nuit were closed to them, Strickland and Captain Nichols sought the hospitality of Tough Bill. This was the master of a sailors' boarding house, a huge mulatto with a heavy fist, who gave the stranded mariner food and shelter till he found him a berth. They lived with him a month, sleeping with a dozen others, Swedes, Negroes, Brazilians, on the floor of the 2 bare rooms in his house which he assigned to his charges, and every day they went with him to the Place Victor Gelu, whither came ship's captains in search of a man. He was married to an American woman, obese and slatternly, fallen to this pass by heaven knows what process of degradation, and every day the boarders took it in turns to help her with the housework. Captain Nichols looked upon it as a smart piece of work on Strickland's part that he had got out of this by painting a portrait of Tough Bill. Tough Bill not only paid for the canvas, colours, and brushes, but gave Strickland a pound of smuggled tobacco into the bargain. For all I know, the picture may still adorn the parlour of the tumble-down little house somewhere near the Quai de la Joliette, and I suppose it could now be sold for £1,500. Strickland's idea was to ship on some vessel bound for Australia or New Zealand, and from there make his way to Samoa or Tahiti. I do not know how he had come upon the notion of going to the South Seas, though I remember that his imagination had long been haunted by an island all green and sunny, encircled by a sea more blue than is found in northern latitudes. I suppose that he clung to Captain Nichols because he was acquainted with those parts, and it was Captain Nichols who persuaded him that he would be more comfortable in Tahiti. "You see, Tahiti's French," he explained to me, "and the French aren't so damned technical." I thought I saw his point. Strickland had no papers, but that was not a matter to disconcert Tough Bill when he saw a profit. He took the first month's wages of the sailor for whom he found a berth, and he provided Strickland with those of an English stoker who had providentially died on his hands. But both Captain Nichols and Strickland were bound east, and it chanced that the only opportunities for signing on were with ships sailing west. Twice Strickland refused a berth on tramps sailing for the United States, and once on a collier going to Newcastle. Tough Bill had no patience with an obstinacy which could only result in loss to himself, and on the last occasion he flung both Strickland and Captain Nichols out of his house without more ado. They found themselves once more adrift. Tough Bill's fare was seldom extravagant, and you rose from his table almost as hungry as you sat down, but for some days they had good reason to regret it. They learnt what hunger was. The cuillère de soupe and the asile de nuit were both closed to them, and their only sustenance was the wedge of bread which the boucher de pain provided. They slept where they could, sometimes in an empty truck on a siding near the station, sometimes in a cart behind a warehouse, but it was bitterly cold, and after an hour or two of uneasy dozing they would tramp the streets again. What they felt the lack of most bitterly was tobacco, and Captain Nichols, for his part, could not do without it. He took to hunting the cannebière for cigarette ends and the butt end of cigars which the promenaders of the night before had thrown away. "I've tasted worse smoking mixtures in a pipe," he added, with a philosophic shrug of his shoulders, as he took a couple of cigars from the case I offered him, putting one in his mouth and the other in his pocket. Now and then they made a bit of money. Sometimes a mail steamer would come in, and Captain Nichols, having scraped acquaintance with the timekeeper, would succeed in getting the pair of them a job as stevedores. When it was an English boat, they would dodge into the forecastle and get a hearty breakfast from the crew. They took the risk of running against one of the ship's officers and being hustled down the gangway with the toe of a boot to speed their going. "There's no harm in a kick in the hindquarters when your belly's full," said Captain Nichols, "and personally I never take it in bad part. An officer's got to think about discipline." I had a lively picture of Captain Nichols flying headlong down a narrow gangway before the uplifted foot of an angry mate, and like a true Englishman rejoicing in the spirit of the mercantile marine. There were often odd jobs to be got about the fish market. Once they each of them earned a franc by loading trucks with innumerable boxes of oranges that had been dumped down on the quay. One day they had a stroke of luck. One of the boarding masters got a contract to paint a tramp that had come in from Madagascar round the Cape of Good Hope, and they spent several days on a plank hanging over the side, covering the rusty hull with paint. It was a situation that must have appealed to Strickland's sardonic humour. I asked Captain Nichols how he bore himself during those hardships. "Never knew him say a cross word," answered the captain. "He'd be a bit surly sometimes, but when we hadn't had a bite since morning, and we hadn't even got the price of a lie down at the Chinks, he'd be as lively as a cricket." I was not surprised at this. Strickland was just the man to rise superior to circumstances when they were such as to occasion despondency in most, but whether this was due to equanimity of soul or to contradictoriness it would be difficult to say. The Chink's Head was a name the beachcombers gave to a wretched inn off the Rue Bouterie, kept by a one-eyed Chinaman, where for 6 sous you could sleep in a cot and for 3 on the floor. Here they made friends with others in as desperate condition as themselves, and when they were penniless and the night was bitter cold, they were glad to borrow from any one who had earned a stray franc during the day the price of a roof over their heads. They were not niggardly, these tramps, and he who had money did not hesitate to share it among the rest. They belonged to all the countries in the world, but this was no bar to good fellowships, for they felt themselves freemen of a country whose frontiers included them all, the great country of cocaine. "But I guess Strickland was an ugly customer when he was aroused," said Captain Nichols reflectively. "One day we ran into Tough Bill in the place, and he asked Charlie for the papers he'd given him. 'You'd better come and take them if you want them,' says Charlie.
He was a powerful fellow, Tough Bill, but he didn't quite like the look of Charlie, so he began cursing him. He called him pretty near every name he could lay hands on, and when Tough Bill began cursing it was worth listening to him. Well, Charlie stuck it for a bit, then he stepped forward and he just said, "Get out, you bloody swine." It wasn't so much what he said, but the way he said it. Tough Bill never spoke another word. You could see him go yellow, and he walked away as if he'd remembered he had a date. Strickland, according to Captain Nichols, did not use exactly the words I have given, but since this book is meant for family reading, I have thought it better, at the expense of truth, to put into his mouth expressions familiar to the domestic circle. Now, Tough Bill was not the man to put up with humiliation at the hands of a common sailor. His power depended on his prestige, and first one and then another of the sailors who lived in his house told them that he had sworn to do Strickland in. One night Captain Nichols and Strickland were sitting in one of the bars of the Rue Bouterie. The Rue Bouterie is a narrow street of one-storied houses, each house consisting of but one room. They are like the booths in a crowded fair, or the cages of animals in a circus. At every door you see a woman. Some lean lazily against the side-posts, humming to themselves or calling to the passer-by in a raucous voice, and some listlessly read. They are French, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, coloured. Some are fat and some are thin, and under the thick paint on their faces, the heavy smears on their eyebrows, and the scarlet of their lips, you see the lines of age and the scars of dissipation. Some wear black shifts and flesh-coloured stockings. Some, with curly hair dyed yellow, are dressed like little girls in short muslin frocks. Through the open door you see a red-tiled floor, a large wooden bed, and on a deal table a ewer and a basin. A motley crowd saunters along the streets. Lascars off a P&O, blonde Northmen from a Swedish barque, Japanese from a man-of-war, English sailors, Spaniards, pleasant-looking fellows from a French cruiser, negroes off an American tramp. By day it is merely sordid, but at night, lit only by the lamps in the little huts, the street has a sinister beauty. The hideous lust that pervades the air is oppressive and horrible, and yet there is something mysterious in the sight which haunts and troubles you. You feel, I know not what primitive force, which repels and yet fascinates you. Here all the decencies of civilization are swept away, and you feel that men are face to face with a sombre reality. There is an atmosphere that is at once intense and tragic. In the bar in which Strickland and Nichols sat, a mechanical piano was loudly grinding out dance music. Round the room people were sitting at table. Here half a dozen sailors, uproariously drunk; there a group of soldiers, and in the middle, crowded together, couples were dancing. Bearded sailors with brown faces and large horny hands clasped their partners in a tight embrace. The women wore nothing but a shift. Now and then two sailors would get up and dance together. The noise was deafening. People were singing, shouting, laughing, and when a man gave a long kiss to the girl sitting on his knees, catcalls from the English sailors increased the din. The air was heavy with the dust beaten up by the heavy boots of the men, and grey with smoke. It was very hot. Behind the bar was seated a woman nursing her baby. The waiter, an undersized youth with a flat, spotty face, hurried to and fro, carrying a tray laden with glasses of beer. In a little while, Tough Bill, accompanied by two huge negroes, came in, and it was easy to see that he was already 3 parts drunk. He was looking for trouble. He lurched against a table at which 3 soldiers were sitting, and knocked over a glass of beer. There was an angry altercation, and the owner of the bar stepped forward and ordered Tough Bill to go. He was a hefty fellow, in the habit of standing no nonsense from his customers, and Tough Bill hesitated. The landlord was not a man he cared to tackle, for the police were on his side, and with an oath he turned on his heel. Suddenly he caught sight of Strickland. He rolled up to him. He did not speak.
He gathered the spittle in his mouth and spat full in Strickland's face. Strickland seized his glass and flung it at him. The dancers stopped suddenly still. There was an instant of complete silence. But when Tough Bill threw himself on Strickland, the lust of battle seized them all, and in a moment there was a confused scrimmage. Tables were overturned, glasses crashed to the ground. There was a hellish row. The women scattered to the door and behind the bar. Passers-by surged in from the street. You heard curses in every tongue, the sound of blows, cries, and in the middle of the room a dozen men were fighting with all their might. On a sudden the police rushed in, and everyone who could made for the door. When the bar was more or less cleared, Tough Bill was lying insensible on the floor with a great gash in his head. Captain Nichols dragged Strickland, bleeding from a wound in his arm, his clothes in rags, into the street. His own face was covered with blood from a blow on the nose. "I guess you'd better get out of Marseilles before Tough Bill comes out of hospital," he said to Strickland, when they had got back to the Chink's Head and were cleaning themselves. "This beats cockfighting," said Strickland. I could see his sardonic smile. Captain Nichols was anxious. He knew Tough Bill's vindictiveness. Strickland had downed the mulatto twice, and the mulatto, sober, was a man to be reckoned with. He would bide his time stealthily. He would be in no hurry, but one night Strickland would get a knife thrust in his back, and in a day or two the corpse of a nameless beachcomber would be fished out of the dirty water of the harbour. Nichols went next evening to Tough Bill's house and made inquiries. He was in hospital still, but his wife, who had been to see him, said he was swearing hard to kill Strickland when they let him out. A week passed. "That's what I always say," reflected Captain Nichols. "When you hurt a man, hurt him bad. Gives you a bit of time to look about and think what you'll do next." Then Strickland had a bit of luck. A ship bound for Australia had sent to the Sailors' Home for a stoker, in place of one who had thrown himself overboard off Gibraltar in an attack of delirium tremens. "You double down to the harbour, my lad," said the captain to Strickland, "and sign on. You got your papers?" Strickland set off at once, and that was the last Captain Nichols saw of him. The ship was only in port for 6 hours, and in the evening Captain Nichols watched the vanishing smoke from her funnels as she ploughed east through the wintry sea. I have narrated all this as best I could, because I like the contrast of these episodes with the life that I've seen Strickland live in Ashley Gardens when he was occupied with stocks and shares. But I am aware that Captain Nichols was an outrageous liar, and I dare say there's not a word of truth in anything he told me. I should not be surprised to learn that he had never seen Strickland in his life, and owed his knowledge of Marseilles to the pages of a magazine. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48. It is here that I purpose to end my book. The first idea was to begin it with the account of Strickland's last years in Tahiti, and with his horrible death, and then to go back and relate what I knew of his beginnings. This I meant to do, not from wilfulness, but because I wished to leave Strickland setting out with I know not what fancies in his lonely soul for the unknown islands which fired his imagination. I liked the picture of him starting at the age of 47, when most men have already settled comfortably into a groove, for a new world. I saw him, the sea grey under the mistral and foam flecked, watching the vanishing coast of France, which he was destined never to see again. And I thought there was something gallant in his bearing and dauntless in his soul. I wished so to end on a note of hope. It seemed to emphasize the unconquerable spirit of man. But I could not manage it. Somehow I could not get into my story, and after trying once or twice I had to give it up. I started from the beginning in the usual way, and made up my mind I could only tell what I knew of Strickland's life in the order in which I learnt the facts. Those that I have now are fragmentary. I am in the position of a biologist who, from a single bone, must reconstruct not only the appearance of an extinct animal, but its habits. Strickland made no particular impression on the people who came in contact with him in Tahiti. To them he was no more than a beachcomber in constant need of money, remarkable only for the peculiarity that he painted pictures which seemed to them absurd; and it was not until he had been dead for some years, and agents came from the dealers in Paris and Berlin to look for any pictures which might still remain on the island, that they had any idea that among them had dwelt a man of consequence. They remembered then that they could have bought for a song canvases which were now worth large sums, and they could not forgive themselves for the opportunity which had escaped them. There was a Jewish trader named Cohen, who had come by one of Strickland's pictures in a singular way. He was a little old Frenchman, with soft kind eyes and a pleasant smile, half trader and half seaman, who owned a cutter in which he wandered boldly among the Paumotus and the Marquesas, taking out trade goods and bringing back copra, shell, and pearls. I went to see him because I was told he had a large black pearl that he was willing to sell cheaply, and when I discovered that it was beyond my means, I began to talk to him about Strickland. He had known him well. "You see, I was interested in him because he was a painter," he told me. "We don't get many painters in the islands, and I was sorry for him because he was such a bad one. I gave him his first job. I had a plantation on the peninsula, and I wanted a white overseer. You never get any work out of the natives unless you have a white man over them. I said to him, 'You'll have plenty of time for painting, and you can earn a bit of money.' I knew he was starving, but I offered him good wages. 'I can't imagine that he was a very satisfactory overseer,' I said, smiling. I made allowances. I've always had a sympathy for artists. It's in our blood, you know. But he only remained a few months. When he had enough money to buy paints and canvases, he left me. The place had got hold of him by then, and he wanted to get away into the bush. But I continued to see him now and then. He would turn up in Papeete every few months and stay a little while. He'd get money out of someone or other and then disappear again. It was on one of those visits that he came to me and asked for the loan of 200 francs. He looked as if he hadn't had a meal for a week, and I hadn't the heart to refuse him. Of course, I never expected to see my money again. Well, a year later he came to see me once more, and he brought a picture with him. He did not mention the money he owed me, but he said, 'Here's a picture of your plantation that I've painted for you.' I looked at it. I did not know what to say, but of course I thanked him, and when he had gone away I showed it to my wife. 'What was it like?' I asked. 'Do not ask me. I could not make head or tail of it. I never saw such a thing in my life.' 'What shall I do with it?' I said to my wife. 'We can never hang it up,' she said. 'People would laugh at us.' So she took it into an attic and put it away with all sorts of rubbish, for my wife can never throw anything away. It is her mania. Then imagine to yourself, just before the war, my brother wrote to me from Paris and said, 'Do you know anything about an English painter who lived in Tahiti? It appears that he was a genius, and his pictures fetch large prices. See if you can lay your hands on anything and send it to me. There's money to be made.' So I said to my wife, 'What about that picture that Strickland gave me? Is it possible that it is still in the attic?' 'Without doubt,' she answered, 'for you know that I never throw anything away. It is my mania.' We went up to the attic, and there, among I know not what rubbish that had been gathered during the 30 years we have inhabited that house, was the picture. I looked at it again, and I said, 'Who would have thought that the overseer of my plantation on the peninsula, to whom I lent 200 francs, had genius? Do you see anything in the picture?' 'No,' she said. 'It does not resemble the plantation, and I have never seen coconuts with blue leaves. But they are mad in Paris, and it may be that your brother will be able to sell it for the 200 francs you lent Strickland.' Well, we packed it up and we sent it to my brother. At last I received a letter from him. What do you think he said? 'I received your picture,' he said, 'and I confess I thought it was a joke you had played on me. I would not have given the cost of postage for the picture. I was half afraid to show it to the gentleman who had spoken to me about it. Imagine my surprise when he said it was a masterpiece, and offered me 30,000 francs. I dare say he would have paid more, but frankly I was so taken aback that I lost my head, and I accepted the offer before I was able to collect myself. Then Monsieur Cohen said an admirable thing. I wish that poor Strickland had been still alive. I wonder what he would have said when I gave him 29,800 francs for his picture. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49. I lived at the Hotel de la Fleur, and Mrs. Johnson, the proprietress, had a sad story to tell of lost opportunity. After Strickland's death, certain of his effects were sold by auction in the market-place at Papeete, and she went to it herself, because there was among the truck an American stove she wanted. She paid 27 francs for it. There were a dozen pictures, she told me, but they were unframed, and nobody wanted them. Some of them sold for as much as 10 francs, but mostly they went for 5 or 6. Just think, if I'd bought them, I should be a rich woman now. But T.R.A. Johnson would never under any circumstances have been rich. She could not keep money. The daughter of a native and an English sea captain settled in Tahiti. When I knew her, she was a woman of 50, who looked older and of enormous proportions. Tall and extremely stout. She would have been of imposing presence if the good nature of her face had not made it impossible for her to express anything but kindliness. Her arms were like legs of mutton, her breasts like giant cabbages. Her face, broad and fleshy, gave you an impression of almost indecent nakedness, and vast chin succeeded to vast chin. I do not know how many of them there were. They fell away voluminously into the capaciousness of her bosom. She was dressed usually in a pink Mother Hubbard, and she wore all day long a large straw hat. But when she let down her hair, which she did now and then, for she was vain of it, you saw that it was long and dark and curly, and her eyes had remained young and vivacious. Her laughter was the most catching I ever heard. It would begin a low peal in her throat, and would grow louder and louder till her whole vast body shook. She loved 3 things: a joke, a glass of wine, and a handsome man. To have known her is a privilege. She was the best cook on the island, and she adored good food. From morning till night you saw her sitting on a low chair in the kitchen, surrounded by a Chinese cook and 2 or 3 native girls, giving her orders, chatting sociably with all and sundry, and tasting the savoury messes she devised. When she wished to do honour to a friend, she cooked the dinner with her own hands. Hospitality was a passion with her, and there was no one on the island who need go without a dinner when there was anything to eat at the Hotel de la Fleur. She never turned her customers out of her house because they did not pay their bills. She always hoped they would pay when they could. There was one man there who had fallen on adversity, and to him she had given board and lodging for several months. When the Chinese laundryman refused to wash for him without payment, she had sent his things to be washed with hers. She could not allow the poor fellow to go about in a dirty shirt, she said, and since he was a man, and men must smoke, she gave him 1 franc a day for cigarettes. She used him with the same affability as those of her clients who paid their bills once a week. Age and obesity had made her inapt for love, but she took a keen interest in the amatory affairs of the young. She looked upon venery as the natural occupation for men and women, and was ever ready with precept and example from her own wide experience. "I was not 15 when my father found that I had a lover," she said. "He was the 3rd mate on the Tropic Bird, a good-looking boy." She sighed a little. They say a woman always remembers her first lover with affection, but perhaps she does not always remember him. "My father was a sensible man." "What did he do?" I asked. "He thrashed me within an inch of my life, and then he made me marry Captain Johnson. I didn't mind. He was older, of course, but he was good-looking too." Tiare, her father had called her by the name of the white-scented flower, which, they tell you, if you have once smelt, will always draw you back to Tahiti in the end, however far you may have roamed. Tiare remembered Strickland very well. "He used to come here sometimes, and I used to see him walking about Papeete. I was sorry for him. He was so thin, and he never had any money. When I heard he was in town, I used to send a boy to find him, and make him come to dinner with me. I got him a job once or twice, but he couldn't stick to anything. After a little while he wanted to get back to the bush, and one morning he would be gone." Strickland reached Tahiti about 6 months after he left Marseilles. He worked his passage on a sailing vessel that was making a trip from Auckland to San Francisco, and he arrived with a box of paints, an easel, and a dozen canvases. He had a few pounds in his pocket, for he had found work in Sydney, and he took a small room in a native house outside the town. I think the moment he reached Tahiti he felt himself at home. Tiare told me that he said to her once, "I've been scrubbing the deck, and all at once a chap said to me, 'Why, there it is!' And I looked up and I saw the outline of the island. I knew right away there was the place I'd been looking for all my life. Then we came near, and I seemed to recognise it. Sometimes when I walk about it all seems familiar. I could swear I've lived here before." "Sometimes it takes them like that," said Tiare. "I've known men come on shore for a few hours while their ship was taking in cargo, and never go back. And I've known men who came here to be in an office for a year, and they cursed the place, and when they went away they took their dying oath they'd hang themselves before they ever came back again. And in 6 months you'd see them land once more, and they'd tell you they couldn't live anywhere else." End of chapter 49. Chapter 50. I have an idea that some men are born out of their due place. Accident has cast them amid certain surroundings, but they have always a nostalgia for a home they know not. They're strangers in their birthplace, and the leafy lanes they have known from childhood, or the populous streets in which they have played, remain but a place of passage. They may spend their whole lives aliens among their kindred, and remain aloof among the only scenes they have ever known. Perhaps it is this sense of strangeness that sends men far and wide in the search for something permanent to which they may attach themselves. Perhaps some deep-rooted atavism urges the wanderer back to lands which his ancestors left in the dim beginnings of history. Sometimes a man hits upon a place to which he mysteriously feels that he belongs. Here is the home he sought, and he will settle amid scenes that he has never seen before, among men he has never known, as though they were familiar to him from his birth. Here at last he finds rest. I told Tiare the story of a man I had known at St. Thomas's Hospital. He was a Jew named Abraham, a blond, rather stout young man, shy and very unassuming, but he had remarkable gifts. He entered the hospital with a scholarship, and during the 5 years of the curriculum gained every prize that was open to him. He was made house physician and house surgeon. His brilliance was allowed by all. Finally, he was elected to a position on the staff, and his career was assured. So far as human things can be predicted, it was certain he would rise to the greatest heights of his profession. Honours and wealth awaited him. Before he entered upon his new duties, he wished to take a holiday, and, having no private means, he went as surgeon on a tramp steamer to the Levant. It did not generally carry a doctor, but one of the senior surgeons at the hospital knew a director of the line, and Abraham was taken on as a favour. In a few weeks the authorities received his resignation of the coveted position on the staff. It created profound astonishment, and wild rumours were current. Whenever a man does anything unexpected, his fellows ascribe it to the most discreditable motives. But there was a man ready to step into Abraham's shoes, and Abraham was forgotten. Nothing more was heard of him. He vanished. It was perhaps 10 years later that, one morning on board ship about to land at Alexandria, I was bidden to line up with the other passengers for the doctor's examination. The doctor was a stout man in shabby clothes, and when he took off his hat I noticed that he was very bald. I had an idea that I had seen him before. Suddenly I remembered. "Abraham," I said. He turned to me with a puzzled look, and then, recognizing me, seized my hand. After expressions of surprise on either side, hearing that I meant to spend the night in Alexandria, he asked me to dine with him at the English Club. When we met again, I declared my astonishment at finding him there. It was a very modest position that he occupied, and there was about him an air of straitened circumstance. Then he told me his story. When he set out on his holiday in the Mediterranean, he had every intention of returning to London and his appointment at St. Thomas's. One morning the tramp docked at Alexandria, and from the deck he looked at the city, white in the sunlight, and the crowd on the wharf. He saw the natives in their shabby gabardines, the blacks from the Soudan, the noisy throng of Greeks and Italians, the grave Turks in tarbooshes, the sunshine and the blue sky. And something happened to him. He could not describe it. It was like a thunderclap, he said. And then, dissatisfied with this, he said it was like a revelation. Something seemed to twist his heart, and suddenly he felt an exultation, a sense of wonderful freedom. He felt himself at home, and he made up his mind there and then, in a minute, that he would live the rest of his life in Alexandria. He had no great difficulty in leaving the ship, and in 24 hours, with all his belongings, he was on shore. "The captain must have thought you as mad as a hatter," I smiled. "I didn't care what anybody thought. It wasn't I that acted, but something stronger within me. I thought I would go to a little Greek hotel. While I looked about, now I felt I knew where to find one, and do you know, I walked straight there, and when I saw it I recognized it at once." "Had you been to Alexandria before?" "No, I'd never been out of England in my life." Presently he entered the government service, and there he had been ever since. "Have you never regretted it?" "Never, not for a minute. I earn just enough to live on, and I'm satisfied. I ask nothing more than to remain as I am till I die. I've had a wonderful life." I left Alexandria the next day, and I forgot about Abraham till a little while ago, when I was dining with another old friend in the profession, Alec Carmichael, who was in England on short leave. I ran across him in the street and congratulated him on the knighthood with which his eminent services during the war had been rewarded. We arranged to spend an evening together for old times' sake, and when I agreed to dine with him, he proposed that he should ask nobody else, so that we could chat without interruption. He had a beautiful old house in Queen Anne Street, and being a man of taste, he had furnished it admirably. On the walls of the dining room I saw a charming Bellotto, and there was a pair of Zophanes that I envied. When his wife, a tall, lovely creature in cloth of gold, had left us, I remarked laughingly on the change in his present circumstances from those when we had both been medical students. We had looked upon it then as an extravagance to dine in the shabby Italian restaurant in the Westminster Bridge Road. Now Alec Carmichael was on the staff of half a dozen hospitals. I should think he earned 10,000 a year, and his knighthood was but the first of the honours which must inevitably fall to his lot. "I've done pretty well," he said, "but the strange thing is that I owe it all to one piece of luck." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, do you remember Abraham? He was the man who had the future. When we were students he beat me all along the line. He got the prizes and the scholarships that I went in for. I always played second fiddle to him. If he'd kept on, he'd be in the position I'm in now. That man had a genius for surgery. No one had a look in with him. When he was appointed registrar at Thomas's, I hadn't a chance of getting on the staff. I should have had to become a GP. And you know what likelihood there is for a GP ever to get out of the common rut. But Abraham fell out, and I got the job. That gave me my opportunity." "I dare say that's true." "It was just luck. I suppose there was some kink in Abraham. Poor devil, he's gone to the dogs altogether. He's got some twopenny halfpenny job in the medical at Alexandria. Sanitary officer or something like that. I'm told he lives with an ugly old Greek woman and has half a dozen scrofulous kids. The fact is, I suppose, that it's not enough to have brains. The thing that counts is character. Abraham hadn't got character." character. I should have thought it needed a good deal of character to throw up a career after half an hour's meditation, because you saw in another way of living a more intense significance. And it required still more character never to regret the sudden step. But I said nothing, and Alec Carmichael proceeded reflectively. Of course, it would be hypocritical for me to pretend that I regret what Abraham did. After all, I've scored by it. He puffed luxuriously at the long Corona he was smoking. But if I weren't personally concerned, I should be sorry at the waste. It seems a rotten thing that a man should make such a hash of life. I wondered if Abraham really had made a hash of life. Is to do what you want most, to live under the conditions that please you, in peace with yourself, to make a hash of life? And is it success to be an eminent surgeon with 10,000 a year and a beautiful wife? I suppose it depends on what meaning you attach to life, the claim which you acknowledge to society, and the claim of the individual. But again I held my tongue, for who am I to argue with a knight? End of chapter 50. Chapter 51. Tiare, when I told her this story, praised my prudence, and for a few minutes we worked in silence, for we were shelling peas. Then her eyes, always alert for the affairs of her kitchen, fell on some action of the Chinese cook which aroused her violent disapproval. She turned on him with a torrent of abuse. The Chink was not backward to defend himself, and a very lively quarrel ensued. They spoke in the native language, of which I had learnt but half a dozen words, and it sounded as though the world would shortly come to an end. But presently peace was restored, and Tiare gave the cook a cigarette. They both smoked comfortably. "Do you know, it was I who found him his wife," said Tiare suddenly, with a smile that spread all over her immense face. "The cook?" "No, Strickland." "But he had one already." "Yes, that's what he said, but I told him she was in England, and England is at the other end of the world." "True," I replied. "He would come to Papeete every 2 or 3 months, when he wanted paints or tobacco or money, and then he would wander about like a lost dog. I was sorry for him. I had a girl here then called Ata to do the rooms. She was some sort of relation of mine, and her father and mother were dead, so I had her to live with me. Strickland used to come here now and then to have a square meal or to play chess with one of the boys. I noticed that she looked at him when he came, and I asked her if she liked him. She said she liked him well enough. You know what these girls are. They're always pleased to go with a white man." "Was she a native?" I asked. "Yes, she hadn't a drop of white blood in her. Well, after I'd talked to her, I sent for Strickland, and I said to him, 'Strickland, it's time for you to settle down. A man of your age shouldn't go playing about with girls down at the front. They're bad lots, and you'll come to no good with them. You've got no money, and you can never keep a job for more than a month or 2. No one will employ you now. You say you can always live in the bush with one or other of the natives, and they're glad to have you because you're a white man. But it's not decent for a white man. Now listen to me, Strickland." Tiare mingled French with English in her conversation, for she used both languages with equal facility. She spoke them with a singing accent which was not unpleasing. You felt that a bird would speak in these tones if it could speak English. "Now, what do you say to marrying Ata? She's a good girl, and she's only 17. She's never been promiscuous like some of these girls. A captain or a first mate, yes, but she's never been touched by a native. Elle se respecte, vois-tu. The purser of the Oahu told me last journey that he hadn't met a nicer girl in the islands. It's time she settled down too, and besides, the captains and the first mates like a change now and then. I don't keep my girls too long. She has a bit of property down by Taravao, just before you come to the peninsula. With copra at the price it is now, you could live quite comfortably. There's a house, and you'd have all the time you wanted for your painting. What do you say to it?" Tiare paused to take breath. "It was then that he told me of his wife in England. 'My poor Strickland,' I said to him, 'they've all got a wife somewhere. That's generally why they come to the islands. Ata is a sensible girl, and she doesn't expect any ceremony before the mayor.
She's a Protestant, and you know they don't look upon these things like the Catholics." Then he said, "But what does Ata say to it?" "It appears that she has a begin for you," I said. "She's willing if you are. Shall I call her?" He chuckled in a funny, dry way he had, and I called her. She knew what I was talking about, the hussy, and I saw her out of the corner of my eyes listening with all her ears, while she pretended to iron a blouse that she'd been washing for me. She came. She was laughing, but I could see she was a little shy, and Strickland looked at her without speaking. "Was she pretty?" I asked. "Not bad, but you must have seen pictures of her. He painted her over and over again. Sometimes with a parejo on, and sometimes with nothing at all. Yes, she was pretty enough. And she knew how to cook. I taught her myself. I saw Strickland was thinking of it, so I said to him, 'I've given her good wages, and she's saved them, and the captains and first mates she's known have given her a little something now and then. She's saved several hundred francs.' He pulled his great red beard and smiled. 'Well, Ata,' he said, 'do you fancy me for a husband?' She didn't say anything, but just giggled. 'But I tell you, my poor Strickland, the girl has a begin for you,' I said. 'I shall beat you,' he said, looking at her. 'How else should I know you loved me?' she answered. Tiare broke off her narrative and addressed herself to me reflectively. 'My first husband, Captain Johnson, used to thrash me regularly. He was a man. He was handsome, 6'3", and when he was drunk there was no holding him. I would be black and blue all over for days at a time. Oh, I cried when he died. I thought I should never get over it. But it wasn't till I married George Rainey that I knew what I'd lost. You can never tell what a man is like till you live with him. I've never been so deceived in a man as I was in George Rainey. He was a fine upstanding fellow too. He was nearly as tall as Captain Johnson, and he looked strong enough, but it was all on the surface. He never drank. He never raised his hand to me. He might have been a missionary. I made love with the officers of every ship that touched the island, and George Rainey never saw anything. At last I was disgusted with him, and I got a divorce. What was the good of a husband like that? It's a terrible thing, the way some men treat women." I condoled with Tiare, and remarked fleetingly that men were deceivers ever, and then asked her to go on with her story of Strickland. "Well," I said to him, "there's no hurry about it. Take your time and think it over. Ata has a very nice room in the annex. Live with her for a month and see how you like her. You can have your meals here. At the end of a month, if you decide you want to marry her, you can just go and settle down on her property." Well, he agreed to that. Ata continued to do the housework, and I gave him his meals as I said I would. I taught Ata to make one or two dishes I knew he was fond of. He did not paint much. He wandered about the hills and bathed in the stream, and he sat about the front looking at the lagoon, and at sunset he would go down and look at Morea. He used to go fishing on the reef. He loved to moon about the harbour, talking to the natives. He was a nice, quiet fellow. And every evening after dinner he would go down to the annex with Ata. I saw he was longing to get away to the bush, and at the end of the month I asked him what he intended to do. He said if Ata was willing to go, he was willing to go with her. So I gave them a wedding dinner. I cooked it with my own hands. I gave them pea soup and lobster à la Portugaise, and a curry and a coconut salad. You never had one of my coconut salads, have you? I must make you one before you go. And then I made them an ice. We had all the champagne we could drink and liqueurs to follow. Oh, I'd made up my mind to do things well. And afterwards we danced in the drawing room. I was not so fat then, and I always loved dancing." The drawing room at the Hotel de la Fleur was a small room with a cottage piano and a suite of mahogany furniture covered in stamped velvet, neatly arranged round the walls. On round tables were photograph albums, and on the walls enlarged photographs of Tiare and her first husband, Captain Johnson. Still, though Tiare was old and fat, on occasion we rolled back the Brussels carpet, brought in the maids and one or two friends of Tiare's, and danced, though now to the wheezy music of a gramophone.
On the verandah the air was scented with the heavy perfume of the tiare, and overhead the Southern Cross shone in a cloudless sky. Tiare smiled indulgently as she remembered the gaiety of a time long past. "We kept it up till 3, and when we went to bed I don't think any one was very sober. I'd told them they could have my trap to take them as far as the road went, because after that they had a long walk. Ata's property was right away in a fold of the mountain. They started at dawn, and the boy I sent with them didn't come back till next day. Yes, that's how Strickland was married." End of Chapter 51.